Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments and subscribe to our latest stories. Before I start, tell me where you are watching me from. I wonder which cities and towns will join me in this memory that will follow me for years. I went to check on him, but I got the shock instead. That evening had started like any other, yet something small, something I couldn't quite name, told me I needed to see him. His house was only a short walk down the street, familiar and tucked away behind an old maple tree that had been standing there longer than either of us had been alive. The sun had nearly set, painting the sky with streaks of burnt orange and violet, and as I wrapped my sweater tighter around me, I wondered if I was overthinking, if maybe I was worrying too much. But that's what I do, I care, sometimes more than I should. He had always been a steady figure in my life, someone who carried a quiet strength in the way he spoke, in the way he walked, even in the pauses he took before answering a question. People like him rarely ask for help, but you can sense when they need it. That's why I told myself I'd just stop by, nothing dramatic, just a knock on his door, a smile, a gentle question. How are you doing? When I arrived, the front porch light wasn't on. That was unusual for him. He was a creature of habit, and that light had always been his signal, both for visitors and, I think, for himself, that home was waiting. I hesitated at the foot of the steps, my heart quickening, my fingers brushing over the railing as if the wood could tell me whether everything inside was fine. The air smelled faintly of damp leaves, and the neighborhood had grown quiet, only the sound of crickets filling the stillness. I knocked once. Then again. No answer. For a moment, I thought about leaving, about convincing myself that he had simply gone out or turned in early. But then I remembered the look on his face the last time we spoke, how his eyes lingered on me a little longer than usual, how his words felt as though they carried something unspoken. That memory pushed me to turn the knob, surprised to find the door unlocked. Inside, the house greeted me with its familiar scent of old books and coffee grounds. The living room lamp cast a soft glow, and I could see his jacket draped neatly over the back of a chair. That small detail stopped me. He was home. I called out his name, gently, not wanting to startle him. No answer. My voice seemed to echo back at me, bouncing off the framed photographs that lined his walls, images of family gatherings, fishing trips, and quiet moments he had once chosen to capture. I moved slowly through the house, my footsteps muffled against the worn rug. The kitchen was tidy, a plate set out on the counter but untouched. A glass of water sat half full beside it. Something about that glass unsettled me. It felt as though he had been there just moments before I arrived, and yet he was nowhere in sight. Finally, I found him, not where I expected, not in the comfort of his favorite chair or at the kitchen table, but sitting on the floor of the den, his back resting against the wall, his gaze fixed on something unseen. He looked tired, as though the weight of the world had pressed down on his shoulders all at once. For a moment, I stood frozen, my hand pressed to my chest, not from fear but from the sudden surge of emotion that rushed through me when he looked up and saw me. His eyes widened, not in anger, not in surprise, but in something far deeper, something raw. I whispered his name again, this time softer, and he shook his head as if to clear away the fog of whatever had been consuming him. I didn't mean for you to see me like this, he said, his voice rough, carrying the weight of both apology and relief. I stepped closer, my knees nearly buckling from the tenderness in that confession. All I could think was how many times people go unseen, how many struggles remain hidden because pride tells us to keep them tucked away. But here he was, no longer hiding, and here I was, suddenly aware that my simple act of checking on him had pulled back a curtain I hadn't even realized existed. I knelt down beside him, not pressing, not asking questions he wasn't ready to answer. Instead, I let the silence between us speak. It was in that silence I felt the bond of years, the unspoken trust that had always been there, now tested and proven in a moment neither of us had planned. We didn't talk much that night. We didn't need to. I stayed with him, the two of us sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall, the world outside carrying on without us. Time seemed to pause, and all I knew was that something had shifted, not just in him, but in me. I had gone to check on him, expecting perhaps a quick conversation, maybe a laugh, maybe nothing at all. Instead, I found a truth, a vulnerability that stitched our lives together in a way that couldn't be undone. As the night deepened and the quiet wrapped itself around us, I realized this was no accident. I was meant to be there, meant to see him not as the unshakable figure I had always imagined, but as a man who needed someone to notice, someone to sit with him when the silence felt too heavy, and in that moment, I understood sometimes the shock isn't in what you discover, but in the way it changes you, forever. The next day, I woke up still thinking about him, about the way he had looked at me, and the quiet that had passed between us the night before. It wasn't an uncomfortable quiet, it was a kind that lingers, like the hush of a church or the calm before dawn. It held weight, though, and it followed me as I poured my morning coffee and stared out the window at the street we both lived on. His house stood there, ordinary from the outside, yet I knew now that something far from ordinary was happening inside, that I wanted to give him space, but at the same time, my heart tugged at me not to let too much time pass. I kept remembering the way his voice cracked when he said, "I didn't mean for you to see me like this." There was no anger in those words, but there was pain. A man like him, so careful to appear steady, didn't easily reveal that side. It made me wonder just how long he had been carrying it all alone. By afternoon, I decided I couldn't ignore it. I baked a small loaf of bread, nothing fancy, just something warm, something that carried the message, "You are not forgotten." As I wrapped it in a clean cloth, I laughed at myself for being so old-fashioned, but there are times when gestures speak louder than words. When I knocked on his door, this time the porch light was on, though faint, as though he had remembered to switch it but didn't care enough to change the weak bulb. He opened the door slowly, and for a moment we just stood there, facing each other. His eyes still carried a tiredness, but there was also something else, a recognition, maybe even a bit of gratitude. "I brought you this," I said, holding out the bread. My voice felt too bright for the dim hallway, but I didn't know how else to start. He looked at it, then at me, and finally stepped aside to let me in. "You didn't have to," he said, though his voice softened when he added, "but I'm glad you did." The house looked different in the daylight, less heavy, though I noticed the details I'd missed before, the stack of unopened mail on the counter, the way a few picture frames had been turned face down, almost as if he couldn't bear to look at them. We sat at the kitchen table, and he sliced into the bread, the crust crackling under the knife. He handed me a piece before taking one himself, and for a while we ate in silence. But this silence wasn't like the one from the night before. It was easier, calmer, like two people waiting for the right words to arrive. "Finally," he spoke. "I know I worried you. Last night. I wasn't myself." He set the knife down and leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window where the maple tree swayed in the wind. "The truth is, I haven't been myself for a long time." I stayed quiet, letting him choose his words. It felt like he was unraveling something that had been knotted up for years, and the least I could do was give him the space to do it. He told me about the changes he'd been facing, the quiet loneliness that crept in when the evenings stretched too long, the weight of memories that felt heavier as the years passed. He didn't cry, but there was a rawness in his voice that carried more than tears ever could. I listened, my chest aching, not with pity, but with recognition. Because in his words, I heard echoes of my own life, the quiet struggles I, too, rarely voiced. When he paused, I finally said, "You don't have to carry it alone anymore. Not if you don't want to." He looked at me then, truly looked, as though measuring whether he could trust the promise behind my words. And in that gaze, I saw a shift, subtle, but real. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking, not just about the heavy things but about lighter ones too. We laughed once or twice, surprising ourselves. It felt like the beginning of something, maybe not a solution, maybe not a cure for what weighed on him, but a beginning all the same. When I left his house that evening, the porch light still glowed behind me, but brighter this time, as though he had finally changed the bulb. It was a small thing, almost unnoticeable, yet to me it felt like a sign. A sign that he wasn't giving up, that maybe, just maybe, he was ready to let someone stand beside him in the quiet. And as I walked back home under the fading light of day, I realized the shock I had felt the night before had begun to settle into something else, a deeper understanding, a connection that was no longer just neighborly, but something more profound, something that had the power to change both of us. Over the next few days, I found myself thinking about him constantly. It was a quiet, persistent pull, one I couldn't ignore even if I tried. Every morning as I drank my coffee, I imagined what he might be doing, if he had eaten, if he had found a way to make the heaviness lighter. It was strange, realizing how much someone else could occupy your thoughts without ever asking for the attention. But there it was, undeniable, and I didn't resist it. By midweek, I decided to stop by again. I told myself it was casual, just checking in, But deep down I knew I was seeking something: connection, understanding, maybe even reassurance that the vulnerability he had shown me wasn't fleeting, that it could be trusted. When I arrived, the front porch light was on, brighter now, steady. That small detail made me smile. The door opened before I even knocked, and there he was, framed by the soft light of the hallway. He seemed different. Not in a dramatic way, but in a subtle shift that I could feel in the air between us. "I was hoping you'd come by," he said. His voice carried warmth now, an ease I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just relief, it was the start of comfort, a recognition that sharing one's burden could bring light rather than shadow. We settled into the living room, the familiar chairs and couch taking on new significance now that the quiet tension from the previous visit had been replaced by something gentler, something that hinted at trust. He poured us each a cup of tea, and the aroma of chamomile and mint filled the room. It was soothing, a subtle signal that this space could be safe, that it could be a place to simply exist without pretense. We talked for hours, not just about the struggles he had been carrying, but about the little things that made life meaningful: the sound of rain on the roof, the taste of fresh bread, the memory of a long-forgotten trip that made him laugh unexpectedly. He told me stories I had never heard before, memories tucked away as if they were too delicate to share. And I listened, absorbing each detail, understanding that the act of listening was as vital as any advice or action I could offer. At one point, he paused mid-story, staring at a framed photograph on the wall. I followed his gaze and saw an old family picture, slightly faded, showing him with someone I assumed was a sibling, smiling in a moment of pure joy. He ran his finger along the frame, almost absent-mindedly, and whispered, "I miss those days more than I thought I would." I reached out, placing my hand gently over his. Not to intrude, not to demand anything, but simply to offer presence. He looked at me, surprised at first, then relaxed into it, a silent acknowledgement passing between us that words weren't needed to convey support. Hours passed like minutes, and eventually, the shadows in the room lengthened as evening approached. The conversation grew quieter, deeper, moving from anecdotes to reflections on life and the choices we make, the moments we miss, the connections we sometimes fear. It was an intimacy born not of romance or grand gestures, but of honesty and shared humanity. Before I left, he walked me to the door. We stood there for a long moment, the world outside dim and quiet, our breaths mingling with the crisp night air. "Thank you," he said softly, his eyes meeting mine with sincerity. "For being here, for listening, for noticing." I nodded, unable to find words that could match the depth of feeling in that moment. I stepped onto the porch, then the path leading to my own home, feeling the strange lightness that comes after witnessing someone's vulnerability and honoring it without judgment. As I walked away, I realized that what had started as concern, a simple desire to check on him, had transformed into something far richer. A shared understanding, a bridge of trust, a realization that even the heaviest burdens could be eased when met with presence and care, and for the first time, I understood that shock. The surprise of finding someone unguarded could lead not to fear or discomfort, but to growth for both of us. That evening, the world seemed quieter, softer, as though it too had noticed the shift. And I carried with me a sense of hope, a quiet assurance that sometimes, the most unexpected visits bring the most meaningful discoveries. After that night, something changed between us, not in dramatic ways, but in the small, almost imperceptible details of our days. The next morning, I woke with a sense of anticipation I hadn't felt in years, a quiet excitement about visiting him again, about simply being present in a way that mattered. Life has a way of moving forward relentlessly, yet here was a pause, a chance to witness someone else's truth, and it made everything else fade into background noise. When I arrived at his house that evening, the porch light welcomed me like an old friend. He opened the door immediately, and for the first time, his smile was effortless, natural, unburdened by anything other than genuine welcome. "I'm glad you're here," he said, and his words held a sincerity that wrapped around me like a warm blanket. Inside, the air felt lighter. The den, where we had spent that first, quiet evening together, seemed to breathe with us. He led me there without hesitation, and we settled side by side on the floor, a ritual now, as though our presence together created its own comfort. I noticed the little things, the soft hum of the heater, the faint scent of the tea we had shared, and the way the sunlight slipping through the window highlighted the lines of his face, each one telling a story I had only begun to understand. We spoke of ordinary things at first, letting conversation drift like leaves on water. But as the minutes passed, we found ourselves touching on deeper reflections, on choices, regrets, and the unexpected lessons life hands us. There was laughter, quiet chuckles that grew from the simplicity of shared understanding, and there were pauses, stretches of silence that felt like a conversation of their own. At one point, he told me about a memory from decades ago, a time when he had felt invincible, yet also alone. He spoke softly, as if afraid to disturb the delicate thread of recollection. I listened, and in his story, I saw the courage it had taken to endure, to keep moving forward despite the weight he carried. And I realized that my visits, my presence, weren't just comforting him, they were allowing him to reclaim parts of himself he had almost forgotten. As the evening deepened, he rose to bring us another cup of tea. The simple act, performed with care, felt profoundly intimate, not in a way that demanded closeness, but in a way that honored connection, respect, and trust. I watched him, noting the quiet dignity in his movements, the way he had learned to accept support without losing the strength that defined him. We returned to the floor, and for a while, no words were needed. Our shoulders occasionally brushed, a reminder that we were sharing the same space, breathing the same air, witnessing life together in a quiet harmony. In that stillness, I felt the culmination of everything that had led to this point: the initial concern, the shock of vulnerability, the tentative trust, and now, a sense of shared understanding that felt both fragile and unshakably real. When it was time for me to leave, we walked to the door together. He paused, looking at me with a softness that made my heart tighten. "You've changed how I see things," he said, voice low but steady. "Not because of what you said, but because of what you've shown me, that I can be myself, fully, and it's okay." I smiled, a lump forming in my throat, feeling the weight of his gratitude settle alongside my own. "You've shown me too," I whispered, "that even the strongest people need someone to notice, to stay, and that it's never too late to let that happen." Outside, the night had grown still. The street was quiet, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, and I felt a sense of closure and continuation at the same time. Something that had begun as a simple check-in had blossomed into a profound emotional connection, one that neither of us had anticipated but both of us needed. As I walked home, I carried a quiet joy with me, a reflection on the power of presence, empathy, and the courage it takes to be seen. I understood then, more than ever, that life's most meaningful moments often arrive unexpectedly, quietly, and that sometimes, the shock we receive is simply the universe nudging us toward growth, understanding, and the deep bonds that make existence truly worthwhile. And though the memory of that first evening would stay with me forever, it was the days and weeks that followed, the trust nurtured, the shared silences, and the laughter woven between them, that became the lasting imprint, a testament to the unspoken, enduring power of human connection.